Oh, anchors, we had to get here eventually. Because in chapter 1, we looked at how this happened. In chapter 2, why. And in chapter 3, let's go with where. Where it all falls down. The word anchor started as a hipster T20 phrase, and now I believe grandmas are shouting at TVs in India. Well, that's how I imagine these things. It really does seem to depend on how you look at it, because at some points, an anchor seems to be almost every batter you don't like. If you look at Michael Wagner's old model, it gives you a fairly good idea of style of player types. It's sorted by balls per boundary and dot ball percentage. As to do it perfectly, you'd have to look at contextual data for each ball faced. Also other things like Prithvi Shaw averaged 4.1 runs per boundary. Andre Russell was at 5.1. But Wagner's basic model, which I believe he came up for tests, still makes sense. Bottom left is the most dynamic players. They don't waste balls and they hit a lot of boundaries. Bottom right is the boundary hitters. Top left is the strike rotators, and then I suppose top right is your anchors, or at the very least, your slowest players. So in the dynamic area, India have Ravi Jadeja, and he is a star with a bat if you look at his numbers, even if he's low usage. Then you have Shikhar Dhawan, who has low runs per boundary mark, and so realistically is probably lucky to slip in here. Not far away is KL Rahul, just up here in the strike rotator. You also have Hardik Pandya near here, but his numbers are a bit all over the place, as he has 2 seasons as a hitter and then 1 as an anchor. Sky just misses out here as well. Down here is Dinesh Karthik, and so far all the players I've mentioned, the only one who has not been involved in the World Cup cycle is Shikhar Dhawan. And if we head over here to the strike rotators, you can see that Shreyas Iyer is here, but the king of strike rotating is Virat Kohli, who is scoring a boundary every 8 balls, which is an incredibly high mark. He's actually the only player I could find with a below average balls per boundary record of the top run scorers. But his dot ball percentage is obviously quite low. But from here, I just want to look at a couple of other players who we skipped earlier but are not far off the pace. Samson, Tripathi and Agarwal. And of course the player not too far away from them is Prithvi Shaw, who we talked about earlier. Now let's move on to a couple of outliers who are not so much in the conversation. I think they are interesting, but perhaps for another day. And then you get to this area here, which is really the anchor zone. There are a lot of players around this area, and some interesting stories with some of them. But let's just go to the best player here, Rohit Sharma, a dot ball eating player who still struggles to find regular boundaries. Now this is just looking at dot ball percentage and balls per boundary. There are other ways of looking at this. And perhaps the easiest way is still average and strike rate. So very basically, top right is your fast scorers who also make a lot of runs. Below them is the hitters. Everyone on the left side of the line is scoring average or slower, but some are still making a lot of runs and others aren't. Here, Jadeja and Sky are the players that feature in the good sector. Then we have a few hitters that are interesting, especially Shaw and Tripathi, but Samson is hard to ignore as well. But now we need to focus on the anchors. KL Rahul is scoring at a level that is beyond comprehension. And then you come all the way down to Virat, who is scoring less than ever, as we're all pretty aware of. And then Rohit, who has managed to score a low amount of runs and doing it slowly. So we can see here they are low scoring anchors at the moment. You can see that other than a couple of players we'll get to in a moment, almost none of the overseas players are anchors. It's all the locals. And India just produced so many of them. This is their thing. And then of course, because of that, they're the top run scorers, and so they get used a lot. But I just want to point out a couple of the overseas players. Here is Kane Williamson, who has always been a slow scorer, but certainly his elbow has had something to do with him slowing down even more of recent times. But his elbow has really put the handbrake on. Pardon the pun. New Zealand kept him in their 11, but remember they have a strike bowling team. And if you come down here, you'll see something fun. This is a 2-person cluster. One of these players is Owen Morgan, who KKR eventually separated from, and then he quit playing for England. Next to him is Rohit Sharma, who led India to this last World Cup. That's really interesting. But it all comes back to the basic thing that India loves this style of player. I'm going to focus here on 3 top Indian talents of recent times. Rishabh Pant was like a batting unicorn when he came through, averaging over 30 and striking 150. Can I whisper AB de Villiers? Then he was slowed down as Ricky Ponting tried to give him more responsibility. And they actually turned him from de Villiers into, I don't know, a fit Kane Williamson? It was a really bizarre idea. You can find a lot of batters who could score an average of 30 with a strike rate of around 120. It's not that hard to manufacture that player. So why turn someone like Rishabh Pant into a guy like that? And so now let's look at Hardik Pandya, who is an even faster scorer than Pant. And he was looking to be on the same trajectory as someone like Andre Russell. And now he's not that at all. he knocks the ball around and scores way more runs, but at a fraction of the strike rate. Now, some of this might be injury related, and some might have been that he was captaining a new side. But there's no doubt that in his last season in the IPL, he was an anchor. And then we move on to KL Rahul. He's a bit more confusing because if you look at his entire career, he did actually have a very slow start. But in 2016 and 2018, Rahul was a monster. He was averaging almost 50 while striking at 150. That is huge. Since then, he's continued to have the high average, but he's now got a strike rate at 135. Almost all those changes came once he left RCB. He certainly had a different role with them. But at their peaks, these players were as good as anyone in the world for long periods of time, and then they slowed down. And the reason I show you all of them is, this is not a one-off. There are many reasons why players slow down in T20 cricket. Sometimes they're afraid of being dropped. I think we could say that's not quite the position here. Other times they slow down because teams work them out. Again, I really don't think that's the case with these players. And so the only other thing is that they either have intentionally decided to attack less, or it's part of a team plan. And I think that's probably what has happened here. And the only one who has reverted back to his old attacking self has been Rishabh Pant. In modern cricket, individual players get blamed. It's no different than basketball or football. We constantly look for faults in these rich paid individuals. But very often it's the system that they're playing in. And in India's case, theirs produces anchors, almost by force if they have to. But I want to focus a bit more on KL Rahul, because he's a player that seems to draw the most ire of Indian fans at the moment. So while he was getting predictably trashed for not making any runs during the World Cup, I wanted to look up something about his record. So this is Rahul versus different bowlers who have delivered to him at least 24 balls. I've ranked each bowler based on their talent. It's a bit subjective. Blue is high, yellow is medium, and green are low. Then I had to cheat some of the numbers, as he hasn't actually been dismissed by all these bowlers yet. So if he didn't have an average, I just looked at his total runs scored, which means there's probably a few more below the line on the left-hand side than there should be. But let's focus at the other end. On the top right corner, he smashes these bowlers and does not get dismissed by them. Bottom right, he smashes, but he gets out a bit as well. Top left is the players who can't get him out at all, but he doesn't score particularly quick against them. And bottom left are the bowlers he doesn't score very much against and also gets dismissed by. So let's do a tour, because you'll see that there's a list of players who he scores off and doesn't get dismissed by and are still very high quality. He almost has as many players of high quality in his top box as he does medium skill bowlers. And look at who these bowlers are. This is proper talent. Taking down Jofra Archer, the Kiwi Quicks, India's best leg spinner, and DJ Bravo is quite a haul. Also, having a record like this against Jasprit Bumrah is incredible. And Bhuvi can't get him out either. Now look at the guys he touches up, but they still dismiss him a little bit. 2 runs a ball against Plunkett is pretty nice, if I'm being honest. And he's killing Nortje over here. And Mr. Wicket's Harshal Patel is averaging almost 50 while going for runs. And he's pretty good against Josh Hazlewood as well. And there are a couple of players right in the middle that could have landed anywhere. The Fizz and Lasith Malinga. If you look at the actual individual numbers here, this is an outstanding record. In fact, I probably did him a disservice the way I drew the lines on here, because I went with an average of 50 and a strike rate of 135, and a normal player would not be anywhere near these numbers. But the truth is, he's way above average against the 4 best death bowlers who've ever played in the IPL. But of course, there are a couple of bowlers who get to him. Hasaranga, Rashid Khan, and Imran Tahir. I think there's a pattern there. Shabazz Ahmed and Akshar Patel also bother him. Another pattern. And there's a couple of seamers as well. Sheldon Cottrell and Jason Berendorf with their left arm, and Kagisa Rabada. But if you have a good record against Hazlewood, Bolt, Nortje, Bhuvi, Bumrah, Bravo, Fizz, Malinga, Narayan, and Jofra Archer, how on earth can anyone say that you're not good enough against the best bowlers in the world? What are we even talking about here? And of course, I could have just started with the fact that he has a lot of big scores in international cricket as well, against good and bad teams, home and away. So when people say he doesn't make runs against good bowlers, it's just quite obviously not true. And if you look at his numbers in the last 2 World Cups, he has an average of 32 with a strike rate of 138. Neither of those is horrible. But if you look who he made runs against, well, this is what everyone is obviously complaining about. He has made runs against horrible teams and failed against the good ones. So, case closed, except for all the stuff I said earlier. Except when you look at his record against the best teams, it is roughly the same as Warner. Rahul has him on average, Davey beats him on strike rate. But it's pretty close either way. And I didn't pick Warner by accident either. In 2021's IPL, David Warner was dropped by the Sunrisers as captain because he couldn't find a run. And when he did, he found them slowly. A few months later, he was the player of the tournament as Australia came together at the last moment to steal that World Cup. He was outstanding in that tournament. And then what happened in the latest edition? He made no runs. What happened to KL Rahul and David Warner is just part of the inherent randomness of T20 innings. It's not some weakness against the world's best bowlers. And part of the reason I'm pointing this out is that KL Rahul over the last few years in the IPL has absolutely proved himself as one of the best players in the world. But his form against a couple of better teams completely masks the bigger problem here. India brought 3 anchors into their World Cup side. Rohit Sharma was not making any runs. Virat Kohli was coming off his worst form of his career. And KL Rahul failed each and every time India needed him. However, and this is what I think is really interesting, I would say that their top 4 did more or less exactly what India would have expected. Virat had a great average, and clearly he was told to bat through the innings. And he might have been slow, but that's what he did. Sky lit teams on fire and also managed to average a lot as well. As I said, KL Rahul's overall numbers are fine, and he scored a decent amount of runs in almost every second match. And even though Rohit Sharma failed by his own standards, he wasn't actually that bad. And considering that the other 3 all made runs, you would have to say that having one guy not star as much is not the end of the world. But the real questions shouldn't be around Rohit Sharma or Virat Kohli batting slow or KL Rahul failing when they needed him. I think the real question is, why do they need so many anchors in their top order to start with? Next episode is When You Don't Plan. If you want to see that one, like, subscribe, press the bell icon. Is Patreon a social media? I don't know. Follow me on the many social medias. I've even got my own Discord if you sign up to my Patreon. Anyway, there's a lot of different ways to find out when this next episode comes out. I think though you should study telekinesis. I'm not actually sure that telekinesis would work in this situation. I think it does.